Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a closer look at the Xgody K30. This is a ultra-budget Android smartphone that sells for around 65 bucks, making it one of the most affordable and locked devices that has a hole punch notch. So what that means is, if we take a closer look at its images, it has a cutout for the front-facing camera, which looks like this, compared to the more conventional water drop notch or larger bezels in general that we see on budget smartphones. However, this is still very much a budget phone. In fact, the design is very closely inspired by the Redmi K30 that it's kind of named after. It's not exactly a clone, but it's very similar looking on the back to Xiaomi and Redmi's phone, which has been very popular in the past year. It has a rear-facing 5-megapixel camera, but what looks like additional lenses are just for decorative purposes. It has a fairly large 6.8-inch IPS LCD display, so it's definitely a phablet, a device that has a very large screen. Otherwise, it's running on an Android Go edition, so it has pretty limited specs, including a quad-core MediaTek processor clocked at 1.3 GHz, coupled with 8 gigs of built-in storage and just 1 GB of RAM. But 1 gig is all you need for Android Go edition, which is a more optimized, light version of Android. Now, the phone comes in multiple colors. The purple version that we have here very closely resembles the aforementioned Xiaomi Redmi K30, and it is worth noting that this phone does not have a removable back cover. So just like most of the other kind of flagships and more expensive phones these days, you can't really hot swap or change the battery. Now, the back here is made out of a plastic polycarbonate material, but surprisingly doesn't feel too cheap, rather solid and rigid. However, it does attract fingerprints pretty easily. As far as the rails of the phone are concerned, they're also constructed out of a polycarbonate plastic, but it feels actually pretty solid, doesn't creak or cringe. And then on the other side, we have a SIM card slot. Inside, you'll find a dual SIM card compartment. It also has the ability for you to use one of the SIM card slots to expand the built-in memory with a micro SD card slot up to 128 gigabytes. On the bottom here, we do have a USB Type-C port for charging again, which is great to see. We also get a loudspeaker and microphone array. It is worth noting, though, that the phone does not come with a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. So just like many of the other kind of more modern phones these days, inspired by Apple's choice, it's gotten rid of that jack, which is unfortunate. So you have to either opt for wireless Bluetooth or use a dongle, although a dongle is not included in the box. What is included, though, is quite an assortment of other accessories, which is impressive at this bargain price, including a TPU carrying case. We also have the wall charger, which is using just a simple kind of USB-based lead, USB Type-C charging and sync cable, along with the quick user guide. There's also the standard SIM ejector tool, as well as some spare screen protectors. That's despite the fact that there's already a factory applied screen protector out of the box. So there's one that has been perfectly aligned already, and then we get two more as replacements, one which is a regular plastic film, and another one which is actually a tempered glass screen protector. By the way, this is what it looks like with it attached. It has a few bumpers for the edges that protects the phone if you accidentally drop it. Now, in terms of the display itself, you can see that it wakes up, and indeed we have the aforementioned rather small hole punch notch on the very top, which is cleverly hidden away under certain wallpapers. You can't really even notice it. And I like it a little more than the conventional water drop notch, which can be a little more distracting when you're watching back media with something in the center. Otherwise, we do have a slightly larger chin on the bottom, but actually not too bad either, because just like the real Redmi K30, any device that has a LCD screen will have a slightly larger chin. But for a device of this price range, you can see here how the bezel size, the left, right, and especially at the top is just very slim and impressive. In terms of the overall kind of system interface, we do get a relatively clean version of Android, I'd say. We do have a drag up gesture here to take a look at our applications. Many of these, which as you can see are just the Go editions of their apps, just to conserve on memory, taking up less space and processing power, but otherwise fairly clean. All the standard Google apps here are pre-installed. Same thing goes with the regular Play Store. Immediate reactions, if we want to talk about the screen quality, is overall it does have decent viewing angles because, again, it is an IPS panel. However, one thing I will say is that the minimum brightness could be worked on a little bit in terms of the software. Right now, even at the minimum setting, I feel like it's still a little bit too bright for reading things at bedtime. So for example, this is the dimmest setting, and if I slightly turn it up, you can see how it doesn't really seem to be making much of a difference until you hit about over here, about a quarter way through. That's when it starts getting noticeably brighter, but the kind of minimum setting here doesn't seem to actually get any dimmer. That's more to do with software optimization, but if they can make the screen just a touch dimmer at night, I think it would be even better. You can long hold, by the way, to take a look at things like changing the wallpaper background and taking a quick look at a preview of how that impacts the kind of visual style. And also you're able to do things like change the animation style that you want to use as well. So it gives you a bit of flexibility, a little reminiscent of Xiaomi or Samsung phones in that sense. What I will say though is it does have this small bottom tray of physical buttons to go back home, multitasking, and go back, which will always be here. However, the phone doesn't support swipe gestures. Otherwise, the overall responsiveness of the phone, I would say, is very much average for a budget phone. It really isn't lightning fast. We are talking about a pretty entry-level processor here. So expect to see a little bit of choppiness as you're navigating along, although it's not too bad. Everything still keeps up with your swipes and fingers, but it's not going to be buttery smooth compared to, say, a flagship that has a super high refresh rate as well as a faster processor. Now, if we take a closer look at the camera performance here, again, it's a very basic camera. We do have HDR that we can turn on to boost the contrast a little bit more. You can switch to the front-facing camera over here, which is 5 megapixels as well. There's also a beauty mode, but you don't really get anything else. In terms of, in a relatively well-lit space, you can still get okay-looking colors, but just not a ton of detail or sharpness. That's just a limitation of the 5 megapixel sensor that we're working with here compared to, say, 13 or 48 megapixels, for example. However, the HDR does help if you're outdoors and want to boost up a bit of kind of shadows and details in the background. Colors still look all right, and so it definitely is a okay camera if you're using it in an emergency, but if you're trying to get a camera phone or device that primarily takes great snaps, this is not going to be, again, the perfect choice for you. But again, it works in a pinch. This is the difference between turning the LED flash on versus having it off. We'll jump into YouTube Go and do a quick demo. Alright, so takeaway is the speaker quality is, however, at least it is placed on the side compared to on the back, for example, so it's a little bit harder to cover up. It's serviceable if we're listening to some quick music by yourself or watching some occasional YouTube vids, but if you want to get a louder, punchier sound, I would recommend connecting to headphones or using a Bluetooth speaker. However, again, works in a pinch. Again, the resolution isn't going to be the highest in the world. It maxes out at around 480p. Technically, the screen is a little bit higher than 480p, but for video's sake, that is kind of the default that's it's going to be sitting at. But as a whole, again, looking quite good, I would say, in terms of a video consumption experience. Reception quality of the phone, which I think is also average or slightly above average, in fact, getting us usually around 3 bars or 4 bars of connectivity to the Wi-Fi, even though the router is a little bit further away right now, so decent in terms of staying connected. What I will say, though, is the phone, in terms of cellular connectivity, is only capped at 3G, and that's perhaps one of the other big limitations of this particular model, just to keep the costs low, even though it's a dual SIM phone, so you can connect to 2 networks at once. That will be one restriction to keep in mind. I want to point out, though, that Xgody does have another model on their website, which also has this pretty similar design, to be honest, along with this small hole punch cutout. And the slightly upgraded A50 model has twice the amount of RAM and memory. So it has 2 gigs of RAM and 16 gigs of built-in storage, which still isn't a huge amount, but will get you slightly better performance. And I think for just $5 more, basically doubling the specs there on memory could be worthwhile. Now, anyways, in terms of the web browsing experience, we can try loading back some sites like The Verge, for instance, and see how quickly it takes to render. You have to wait a split second longer, but it really is just a second or two. Afterwards, things are fully loaded, really, without any real problems. Scrolling actually still feels surprisingly smooth, as you can see here. Here's Amazon that we can see here, also loading along without too much problems. A split-second delay, as you can see there, sometimes will appear, which is natural for entry-level specs like this. But it's still doing the job and ticking along here without too much issues overall, I'd say. We can return back home, and some other things I want to quickly point out. This phone does have the gesture of double tapping the screen to wake it up. That is pretty neat to see. And in terms of other applications that we have baked in here. There are a few ones that we see specialized from Xgody, including a version of Face Unlock that uses the front-facing camera as a biometric. However, it's not super secure, so I would recommend a PIN or a password if you want to get a higher level of security. However, the phone doesn't have a fingerprint scanner, so that is one biometric option that is currently missing. Again, forgivable at this price, I'd say. A few preloaded social media apps, however, like Facebook and Messenger, which have been installed out of the box, but if you don't like to use those, you can also uninstall them yourself. Now, the phone claims to run on Android 10.0, but I'm not completely convinced on the version of the Android here because the background looks a little bit different from what I'm expected to. Regardless, it is still going to install the latest versions of games and apps from the Play Store without too much issues, as long as you have sufficient memory. So again, you can install that on the SD card if you want to boost the amount of available space. Really, the last thing to talk about, I think, would be just the general gaming performance, which is not really a forte either on this phone because of the, again, aging quad-core chip here from MediaTek. However, it still does okay for simpler titles. For the most part, things are still definitely playable, and the larger display that you get here is still, for the most part, contributing to a rather immersive experience. So okay for puzzle games, lighter games like Stack that you see here, Angry Birds, things like that. You can technically still install games like PUBG, for instance, but that will definitely be taxing the processor quite fast. You have to really encounter a lot of drop frames, and it won't be the most enjoyable experience. And the display is probably the best part about this phone because of the fact that we have a pretty large canvas to work with, and that results in a pretty decent experience as you're playing things along. Again, after the games do load, even though it takes a split second longer maybe to load compared to a more expensive phone, things are still going to run along just fine. Now, after extended usage of more than, I say, an hour, the phone does get slightly warm towards the bottom region of the device, but never gets too hot that it thermal throttles or cripples the experience. So overall, definitely still is serviceable. So that's more or less it as far as our quick hands-on review of the Xgody K30. This is a ultra budget phone again that I would say the best thing about it really is that display. It's not necessarily the sharpest or fastest frame rates, but at least viewing angles are pretty good. It gets sufficiently bright and also has that pretty modern cutout in terms of the placement of the webcam or front-facing camera. It's going to be more discreet in the corner compared to the more popular and conventional water drop style that we usually see in budget phones. And as a result, it gets you a more immersive experience as you're watching back videos and playing back games and even browsing the web. It really is comparable to other budget phones that you'll find on the market for around this price range, especially Android Go edition phones usually perform like this. Although you can't expect buttery smooth frame rates, it's also going to be significantly cheaper than most other phones on the market. You're just paying a fraction of the price here really for a device that you can use for backup, for entertainment, multimedia, watching videos, or giving it to a child without being afraid of it breaking. So if you like what you see here, you can check out more details in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Xgody K30 budget Android smartphone with a punch hole display.